Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our coaching, publishing, executive ghostwriting, and podcast production services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we're being joined by Mark Leiren-Young, author of Orcas Everywhere, that is coming out in September, and Mark has also published multiple books previously. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Are you ready to get started?
Absolutely.
All right, question number 1. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
Write something that you care about. You're going to be living with this book the rest of your life. You're going to be talking about this book for years after it's done. This is, people talk about the permanent record. This is your permanent record. So write something you care about.
And what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
Wow. In some respects, it's kind of figuring out what approach you want to take, because different books really work better with different publishers. Some things you might want to do yourself, some things you might want a large publisher for. It's figuring out your goals and being really clear on what you want to accomplish with the book and finding a publisher who works with those goals.
And then in regards to publishing, you mentioned you've gone through a publisher for just about all your books, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Which publishing company, if you don't mind me asking?
I've worked with a lot of Canadian publishing companies. I know that you're based in Texas, but I'm sure you've got listeners around the world. I've got a few books coming out with Orca Publishing in Canada. Those are kids' books. I've worked with Greystone, which is an amazing publisher out of Vancouver, and a book with Knopf Canada. So I've worked with a lot of mainstream publishers in Canada, and smaller publishers, Harbor, Heritage, great BC publishers.
And what was your experience working with those publishers?
It's really been interesting, because one of the things that I think you assume as an author is that the moment that you're published, your job is done. And really it's consistent whether the publisher's a small publisher or a large publisher. The book coming out, that's just the start. And you've got to do your own work to get your book out there. You've got to do your own work to get yourself out there. And, the more you help the publisher, the more they can help you.
Absolutely. Well, on the other side of things, as you know, we have publishing, then we have marketing. So please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launches that has worked well.
Well, I've been a huge fan of podcasting since, the ancient days before Serial existed. And I got into it when I released a movie that I helped produce. I did a movie called The Green Chain, 10 years and change ago now. And I wanted a continuation of the story. I didn't want people to leave the movie and have nowhere to discuss it. So I created a podcast series, and that kept the conversation going. With my latest book, The Killer Whale Who Changed the World, I created a podcast series called Scanna, and that's kind of continued the conversation around the book. And it's ranked as high as number 4 in natural sciences. And we just talk about orcas and oceans. And it lets me continue all the conversations that started with that book.
So you're talking about creating a podcast specifically for a certain book?
Really, for me, it came out of the topic, but I know a lot of authors have created podcast series, limited editions around their books. For me, because I tend to obsess over the topic I'm writing about, in this case, it's orcas, specifically the southern resident orcas around BC and Washington. If you remember, about a year ago, there was an orca who carried her dead calf for 17 days, and that story was reported around the world. So I've been covering things like that. So it's really a deep dive into other areas that spring out of the book. So the conversation continues.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
My favorite book would be Last Chance to See by Douglas Adams, who I think is one of the funniest writers who ever lived. He wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he worked with a BBC broadcaster who is also a naturalist, Mark Carwardine, and they went off and checked out endangered species around the world. And what I learned from it was he was looking at one of the toughest topics imaginable. He was looking into endangered species, and because he was Douglas Adams, he was able to make that funny. And just coming at something from a completely different perspective. And I gather that was his favorite book as well. That was the favorite thing he ever wrote. And it's just an amazing book. Can't recommend it enough.
And for a final question, what is your favorite quote and why?
Oh, since we're talking about the publishing industry in 2019, I've got to go with a quote from William Goldman. And he was talking about the screen industry, and he said, nobody knows anything. Not one person in the entire motion picture field knows for a certainty what's going to work. Every time out, it's a guess, and if you're lucky, it's an educated one. And that is so true in the world of publishing today as well.
Well, Mark, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
I am at Leiren-Young.com. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and please check out the podcast, SKAANA. We're all over iTunes and all the great places you get podcasts. And I'd love to talk to you. Thanks so much for having me on, Paul.
Thank you once again for being on the show, Mark, and I wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how you can be featured in our brand new Get Published business book, go to getpublishedpodcast.com.